Chapter 11. On the Way to the Scaffold. Before placing the condemned people in coaches, all five were brought together in a large cold room with a vaulted ceiling, which resembled an office, where people worked no longer, or a deserted waiting room. They were now permitted to speak to one another. Only Tanya Kovalchuk availed herself at once of the permission. The others firmly and silently shook each other's hands, which were as cold as ice and hot as fire, and, silently, trying not to look at each other, they crowded together in an awkward, absent-minded group. Now that they were together, they felt somewhat ashamed of what each of them had experienced when alone, and they were afraid to look, so as not to notice or to show that new, peculiar, somewhat shameful sensation that each of them felt or suspected the others of feeling. But after a short silence, they glanced at each other, smiled, and immediately began to feel at ease and unrestrained as before. No change seemed to have occurred, and if it had occurred, it had come so gently over all of them that it could not be discerned in any one separately. All spoke and moved about strangely, abruptly, by jolts, either too fast or too slowly. Sometimes they seemed to choke with their words and repeated them a number of times. Sometimes they did not finish a phrase they had started, or thought they had finished. They did not notice it. They all blinked their eyes and examined ordinary objects curiously, not recognizing them, like people who had worn eyeglasses and had suddenly taken them off. And all of them frequently turned around abruptly, as though someone behind them was calling them all the time and showing them something. But they did not notice this either. Musya and Tanya Kovalchuk's cheeks and ears were burning. Sergei was at first somewhat pale, but he soon recovered and looked as he always did. Only Vasily attracted everyone's attention. Even among them he looked strange and terrible. Werner became agitated and said to Musya in a low voice with tender anxiety, "What does this mean, Musyechka? Is it possible that he... What? I must go to him." Vasily looked at Werner from the distance, as though not recognizing him, and he lowered his eyes. "Vasya, what have you done with your hair? What is the matter with you? Never mind, my dear, never mind. It will soon be over. We must keep up. We must. Vasily was silent, but when it seemed that he could no longer say anything, a dull, belated, terrible remote answer came, like an answer from the grave. "I'm all right. I hold my own." Then he repeated, "I hold my own." Werner was delighted. That's the way. Good boy. That's the way. But his eyes met Vasily's dark, weary glance fixed upon him from the distance, and he thought with instant sorrow, from where is he looking? From where is he speaking? And with profound tenderness with which people address a grave, he said, "Vasya, do you hear? I love you very much." "So do I love you very much," answered the tongue, moving with difficulty. Suddenly Musya took Werner by the hand, and with an expression of surprise she said, like an actress on the stage, with measured emphasis, "Werner, what is this? You said, 'I love'? You never before said 'I love' to anybody. Why are you all so tender and serene? Why?" "Why?" And, like an actor, also accentuating what he felt, Werner pressed Musya's hand firmly. "Yes, now I love very much. Don't tell it to the others. It isn't necessary. I feel somewhat ashamed, but I love deeply." Their eyes met and flashed up brightly, and everything about them seemed to have plunged in darkness. It is thus that in the flash of lightning all other lights are instantly darkened, and the heavy yellow flame casts a shadow upon the earth. "Yes," said Musya. "Yes, Werner." "Yes," he answered. "Yes, Musya. Yes." They understood each other, and something was firmly settled between them at this moment, and his eyes glittering, Werner again became agitated and quickly stepped over to Sergei. "Serjoshka!" But Tanya Kovalchuk answered, almost crying with maternal pride. She tugged Sergei frantically by the sleeve. "Listen, Werner, I am crying here for him. I am wearing myself to death, and he is occupying himself with gymnastics." "According to the Mueller system," smiled Werner. Sergei knit his brow confusedly. "You needn't laugh, Werner. I have convinced myself conclusively." All began to laugh. Drawing strength and courage from one another, they gradually regained their poise, became the same as they used to be. They did not notice this, however, and thought they had never changed at all. Suddenly Werner interrupted their laughter and said to Sergei very earnestly, "You are right, Serjolska. You are perfectly right." "No, you must understand," said Golovin gladly. "Of course we—" But at this point they were asked to start, and their jailers were so kind as to permit them to ride in pairs as they pleased. Altogether the jailers were extremely kind, even too kind. It was as if they tried partly to show themselves humane and partly to show that they were not there at all, but that everything was being done as by machinery. But they were all pale. "Musia, you go with him." Werner pointed at Vasily, who stood motionless. "I understand," Musia nodded. "And you?" "I? Tanya will go with Sergei, you go with Vasya. I will go alone." "That doesn't matter. I can do it. You know." When they went out into the yard, the moist, soft darkness rushed warmly and strongly against their faces, their eyes, taking their breath away. Then suddenly it penetrated their bodies tenderly and refreshingly. It is hard to believe that this wonderful effect was produced simply by the spring wind, the warm, moist wind. And the really wonderful spring night was filled with the odor of melting snow, and through the boundless space the noise of drops resounded. Hastily and frequently, as though trying to overtake one another, little drops were falling, striking in unison a ringing tone. Suddenly one of them would strike out of tune, and all was mingled in a merry splash and hasty confusion. Then a large heavy drop would strike firmly, and again the fast spring melody resounded distinctly. And over the city, above the roofs of the fortress, hung a pale redness in the sky, reflected by the electric lights. "Ach!" Sergei Golovin heaved a deep sigh and held his breath, as though he regretted to exhale from his lungs the fine, fresh air. "How long have you had such weather?" inquired Werner. "It's really spring." "It's only the second day," was the polite answer. Before that we had mostly frosty weather." The dark carriages rolled over noiselessly, one after another, took them in by two, started off into the darkness, there where the lantern was shaking at the gate. The convoys, like grey silhouettes, surrounded each carriage. The horseshoes struck noisily against the ground or plashed upon the melting snow. When Werner bent down, about to climb into the carriage, the gendarme whispered to him, "There's somebody else going along with you." Werner was surprised. "Where? Where's he going?" "Oh, yes, another one. Who is he?" The gendarme was silent. Indeed, in a dark corner, a small, motionless, but living figure pressed close to the side of the carriage. By the reflection of the lantern, Werner noticed the flash of an open eye. Seating himself, Werner pushed his foot against the other man's knees. "Excuse me, comrade." The man made no reply. It was only when the carriage started that he suddenly asked in broken Russian, speaking with difficulty, "Who are you?" "I am Werner, condemned to hanging for the attempt on N. And you?" "I am Jensen. They must not hang me." They were riding thus in order to appear 2 hours later face to face before the inexplicable great mystery, in order to pass from life to death, and they were introducing each other. Life and death moved simultaneously, and until the very end life remained life, to the most ridiculous and insipid trifles. "What have you done, Jansen?" "I killed my master with a knife. I stole money." It seemed from the tone of his voice that Jansen was falling asleep. Werner found his flabby hand in the darkness and pressed it. Jansen withdrew it drowsily. "Are you afraid?" asked Werner. "I don't want to be hanged." They became silent. Werner again found the Estonian's hand and pressed it firmly between his dry, burning palms. Jansen's hand lay motionless like a board, but he made no longer any effort to withdraw it. It was close and suffocating in the carriage. The air was filled with the smell of soldiers' clothes, mustiness, and the leather of wet boots. The young gendarme who sat opposite Werner breathed warmly upon him, and in his breath there was the odor of onions and cheap tobacco. But some brisk, fresh air came in through certain clefts, and because of this, spring was felt even more intensely in this small, stifling, moving box than outside. The carriage kept turning now to the right, now to the left. Now it seemed to turn back. At times it seemed as though they had been turning around on one and the same spot for hours for some reason or another. At first a bluish electric light penetrated through the lowered heavy window shades. Then suddenly, after a certain turn, it grew dark, and only by this could they guess that they had turned into deserted streets in the outskirts of the city, and that they were nearing the S railroad station. Sometimes during the sharp turns, Werner's live bent knee would strike against the live bent knee of the gendarme, and it was hard to believe that the execution was approaching. "Where are we going?" Jansen asked suddenly. He was somewhat dizzy from the continuous turning of the dark box, and he felt slightly sick at his stomach. Werner answered and pressed the Estonian's hand more firmly. He felt like saying something especially kind and caressing to this little sleepy man, and he already loved him as he had never loved anyone in his life. You don't seem to sit comfortably, my dear man. Move over here to me." Jansen was silent for a while. Then he replied, "Well, thank you. I'm sitting all right. Are they going to hang you too?" "Yes," answered Werner, almost laughing with unexpected jollity. And he waved his hand easily and freely, as though he were speaking of some absurd and trifling joke which kind but terribly comical people wanted to play on him. "Have you a wife?" asked Jansen. "No, I have no wife. I am single." "I am also alone." "Alone," said Jansen. Werner's head also began to feel dizzy, and at times it seemed they were going to some festival, strange to say. Almost all those who went to the scaffold experienced the same sensation and mingled with sorrow and fear. There was a vague joy as they anticipated the extraordinary thing that was soon to befall them. Reality was intoxicated with madness, and death, united with life, brought forth apparitions. It seemed very possible that flags were waving over the houses.